Apparently the only thing keeping us from liberty is a few more ideas.
A few more ideas. I mean, it's so confusing, isn't it? So much going wrong, so much to say, and all of it happening so quickly. The pace of repression outstrips our ability to understand it, and that is the real trick of the imperial thought machine. It's easier to hide behind 40 atrocities than a single incident. But they have a fight on their hands, don't they? Our elemental rights are such a simple thing to hold, they will have to shake the galaxy awfully hard to loosen our grip.
Welcome back to the Dialectic Dose. I'm your host, Austin Constantino. Last time on the Dialectic Dose, we began the story of Karl Marx. Tracing his journey from his birth in Trier through his university years in Berlin, where he encountered Hegel's revolutionary dialectic philosophy. We followed him to Paris, where he met Friedrich Engels and developed his theory of alienation. Then to Brussels, where together they formulated historical materialism and wrote the Communist Manifesto. We witnessed Marx's participation in the 1848 revolutions across Europe, his work as a radical newspaper editor in Cologne, and finally, his forced exile as the revolutionary tide turned and reaction set in across the continent. When we left Marx, he was fleeing from country to country, driven by authorities who feared his revolutionary ideas, carrying with him only his family, his notebooks, and an unshakable commitment to understanding the world in order to change it. London in the mid-19th century was the capital of the world's first industrial nation and the center of the largest empire in history. Its streets contained both extraordinary wealth and desperate poverty. Luxurious West End clubs alongside East End slums, where families crowded into single rooms. The Thames, polluted with industrial waste and raw sewage, divided a city of stark contrast, a living laboratory of capitalism's contradictions. When Marx and his family arrived in 1849, they found temporary lodging in the German immigrant neighborhood of Soho. Their first home was a cramped two-room apartment at 64 Dean Street, a far cry from the comfortable bourgeois existence Jenny had known in her youth. The Marx family would move frequently during their early years in London, always one step ahead of creditors. These were the darkest days for the Marx family. Karl and Jenny now had 4 children: Jenny Caroline, called Jenny Chen, Laura, Edgar, called Mush, and Heinrich Guido. They would soon have 3 more: Franziska, Eleanor, called Tussi, and a stillborn son. Trying to maintain a semblance of middle-class respectability despite their poverty, they employed a loyal family servant, Helene Lenchen de Muth, who had been with Jenny since her youth in Trier. Daily life was a constant struggle. Marx pawned everything from the family silver, a wedding gift, to his own overcoat to buy food or medicine. Sometimes the family subsisted on bread and potatoes for days. Jenny recalled,
"I shall never forget how I found him one morning. He told me that all the children's little socks were wet through, and all their shoes. I found them all together in the same bed, trembling with cold and hungry, silently crying."
Marx himself rarely complained about these conditions in his correspondence, but he was tormented by the suffering they caused his family. His letters to Engels during this period often contained desperate pleas for financial help alongside theoretical discussions, a juxtaposition that reveals both the material conditions under which his ideas developed and the remarkable resilience of his intellectual work in the face of personal crisis. The toll was severe. 3 of Marx's children died in London, 2 as infants, and 1, his beloved son Edgar Musch, at age 8. Marx was devastated by these losses, especially Musch's death in 1855. He wrote to Engels, "I have already experienced misfortunes, but only now do I know what real unhappiness is. Amid all the fearful torments I have recently suffered, the thought of you and your friendship has always sustained me, as has the hope that we still have something worthwhile to do together in this world." Edgar's death was particularly traumatic. Marx had doted on his only son, often telling him stories from the Iliad and Odyssey as they walked through London parks. The boy died slowly of tuberculosis, with Marx spending sleepless nights at his bedside. After the child's death, Marx confessed that he could no longer bear to be in the silent house and wandered the streets of London in his grief. Jenny Marx described their situation in a heartbreaking letter.
3 children have died before our eyes. 2 girls and a boy. I sat by their little beds and watched them die. Our little Francesca died of severe bronchitis. Edgar, who was a wonderfully gifted child, died of intestinal tuberculosis. The poor child suffered terribly.
The family could not even afford a proper burial plot for their children. Edgar and Francesca were buried in paupers' graves, their exact locations eventually lost. Marx would later be tormented by the knowledge that he couldn't even visit their final resting places. For Marx, the reading room of the British Museum became both sanctuary and workplace. Opening at 9 a.m. and closing at 7 p.m., it offered warmth, light, and access to the world's most comprehensive collection of books and reports. Marx established a daily routine, working at his designed seat, G7, surrounded by a stack of books. The journalist who observed him there described,
"A man whose appearance immediately attracts attention. With his broad forehead, his cold black hair and beard, his eyes are dark, but they are profound and restrained in their fire. His features bear the stamp of energy and intensity of mind, while the slightest smile reveals extreme kindness and love of mankind."
The Marx family's circumstances improved somewhat in the late 1850s and 1860s. They moved to 9 Grafton Terrace in Kentish Town, a more respectable area. Marx found occasional work as a correspondent for the New York Tribune, which paid modestly but regularly. The family received a small inheritance from Jenny's mother, and most importantly, Engels increased his financial support after becoming a partner in his family's Manchester firm. Daily life in the Marx household during these somewhat better times was lively and intellectual. The family spoke multiple languages, often switching mid-sentence. They read Shakespeare aloud in the evenings, with each family member taking different parts. The 3 surviving daughters, Jenny Chen, Laura, and Eleanor, were educated far beyond what was typical for Victorian girls, learning languages, literature, music, and political economy. Eleanor, Tussie, the youngest daughter, and her father's favorite in his later years, recalled,
"Father was the most joyous and merry of companions. He was an exceptionally kind and indulgent father. He never gave an order. He was a companion and playmate of his children. He had read the whole of Shakespeare to us and could recite entire scenes by heart."
Despite the family's financial difficulties, the Marx home was a center of intellectual and political activity. Sundays often saw gatherings of revolutionary exiles from across Europe, with intense political discussions in multiple languages, singing of revolutionary songs, and copious amounts of food and drink. Marx was known to recite lengthy passages from the Divine Comedy in Italian or Shakespeare in English, occasionally standing on a table after a few glasses of wine. During these years of personal tragedy and financial struggle, Engels provided crucial support. Working at his family's textile firm in Manchester, he regularly sent money to keep the Marx family afloat. This economic support was as much a political act as a personal one. Engels recognized the importance of Marx's theoretical work and made his own sacrifice to ensure it could continue. Their correspondence from this period reveals both their deep friendship and their intellectual partnership. They wrote to each other several times a week, discussing politics, economics, family matters, and occasionally exchanging bawdy jokes. Engels was a godfather to Marx's children and would eventually become the executor of his literary estate. When Engels finally retired from the hated businessman's treadmill in 1869, he moved to London and could see Marx daily. They often walked together on Hampstead Heath, discussing politics and developing ideas. Engels lived nearby with Lizzie Burns, the Irish working-class woman who was his partner, and who had followed her sister Mary, Engels' earlier companion, in this role. The years of London exile weren't dedicated solely to theoretical work. Marx remained deeply engaged with working-class politics. In 1864, he helped found the International Workingsmen Association, later known as the First International, which united various working-class and radical organizations across Europe and even reached to North America. Despite these hardships, or perhaps partly because of his direct experience of poverty, Marx threw himself into the monumental research project that would become Capital. He devoured economic theory, pored over factory inspection reports, studied the development of machinery, and traced the history of property relations. The scale of his research was staggering. Marx filled notebooks with excerpts and commentary on works in multiple languages, developed and revised his theoretical framework repeatedly, and struggled to find a form that could adequately express the complex totality of the capitalist mode of production. While working on Capital, Marx wasn't entirely removed from practical politics. In 1864, he helped found the International Workingsmen Association, later known as the First International, which united various working-class and radical organizations across Europe and even reached North America. Marx wrote its inaugural address, which included this powerful description of capital's contradictions.
In all countries of Europe, it is now become a truth demonstrable to every unprejudiced mind, and only denied by those whose interest is to hedge other people in a fool's paradise, that no improvement of this machinery, no appliance of science to production, no contrivances of communication, no new colonies, no new emigration, no opening of markets, no free trade, nor all these things put together, will do away with the miseries of the industrious masses. But that, on the present false base, every fresh development of the productive powers of labor must tend to deepen social contrast and point social antagonisms.
In 1867, after years of struggle, illness, and relentless work, Marx published Volume 1 of Capital, the only volume completed and published during his lifetime. Let's explore this masterwork, which represents the fullest expression of his critique of political economy. Capital is not merely an economic text. It is a comprehensive analysis of capitalism as a historical social formation, a critique of previous economic thought, and an exploration of the possibilities for human emancipation. The book begins with an analysis of the commodity, the basic cell form of capitalist society. Marx shows how commodities have both use value, their usefulness for human needs, and exchange value, their proportional worth in the market exchange. This dual nature of commodities reflects a deeper duality in the labor that produces them. Concrete labor, the specific useful activity, and abstract labor, the general expenditure of human energy that creates value. From this starting point, Marx develops his labor theory of value, demonstrating that the value of commodities is determined by the socially necessary labor time required for their production. This theory isn't a moral claim about how prices should be set, but an analysis of how capitalism actually functions beneath its surface appearances. The most revolutionary aspect of Marx's analysis is his theory of surplus value, the source of profit in capitalism. Marx shows that workers sell not their labor, but their labor power, their capacity to work, to capitalists. The working day is divided into necessary labor time, when workers produce value equivalent to their wages, and surplus labor time, when they produce extra value appropriated by the capitalists.
The rate of surplus value is therefore an exact expression for the degree of exploitation of labor power by capital
or of the worker by the capitalist. This exploration isn't a deviation from capitalist norms, but its very foundation. No matter how kind individual capitalists might be, the system's competitive pressures compel them to extract maximum surplus value from their workers. Marx goes on to analyze the accumulation of capital, showing how it leads to technological change, increasing organic composition of capital, more machines relative to workers, falling profit rates, and recurring crisis. He demonstrates how primitive accumulation, the violent separation of producers from their means of production through colonization, enclosure, and other forms of theft, create the preconditions for capitalism. Throughout Capital, Marx employs not just economic analysis, but literary references, historical examples, and even Gothic imagery to convey the vampire-like nature of capital, dead labor sucking the life from living labor. The book concludes with a vision of capitalism's potential transcendence. The centralization of the means of production and the socialization of labor reach a point at which they become incompatible with their capitalist entourage. This entourage is burst asunder. The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated. While Capital is often considered a difficult work, its core insights remain essential for understanding our world. Marx reveals capitalism not as a natural, eternal system, but as a historical mode of production with specific contradictions that generate both immense productive powers and profound human cost. The final years of Marx's life were marked by declining health, family tragedy, and continued intellectual work. In 1870, the Marx family moved to 41 Maitland Park Road in North London, which would be their final home. The modest two-story house had a small garden where Marx would sometimes sit on warmer days, reading newspapers or playing with his grandchildren. By this time, Marx's appearance had transformed into the iconic image we now recognize: the wild mane of graying hair, the full beard, the penetrating eyes. His health was deteriorating. Years of overwork, poor nutrition, and heavy smoking had taken their toll. He suffered from painful carbuncles, skin infections, liver problems, and a chronic cough that suggested tuberculosis. He described his body as this machine that I am condemned to abuse for a while longer. Despite his physical decline, Marx's mind remained sharp and engaged with world events. The early 1870s brought monumentous developments that demanded his analysis: the Franco-Prussian War, the Paris Commune, and the continuing growth of the workers' movement across Europe. The Paris Commune of 1871, a working-class revolution that briefly took power in Paris, deeply affected him. For 72 days, from March 18th to May 28th, Parisian workers established a radical democratic government that abolished night work for bakers, remitted housing rents, separated church from state, and began implementing workers' control of abandoned factories. Marx followed these events with passionate intensity. His daughters, Jenny and Eleanor, helped collect newspaper reports from France, and the family discussed each new development. When the French government violently suppressed the Commune, killing an estimated 20,000 people in what became known as the Bloody Week, Marx was devastated, but determined to defend the communards' memory and draw lessons from their experience. Working through nights fueled by black coffee and cigarettes, he produced The Civil War in France, a powerful defense of the Commune published by the International Workingmen's Association. In it, Marx drew the conclusion that workers cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for their own purpose. Instead, the old state apparatus must be smashed and replaced with truly democratic forms of governance, like those the Commune had begun to develop. This pamphlet made Marx infamous in respectable circles. Newspapers denounced him as the Red Terrorist Doctor and the mastermind behind revolutionary violence. Police monitored his home, and friends warned of possible assassination attempts. Yet the work also won Marx new admirers among workers and radicals who recognized the clarity and the courage of his analysis. Amid these political battles, the Marx household remained a center of vibrant family life and intellectual exchange. By the 1870s, Marx's daughters were grown women, each developing her own path while remaining closely connected to their father's work. Jenny, the eldest, called Jenny Chen to distinguish her from her mother, became engaged to Charles Longuet, a French revolutionary who had participated in the Commune and escaped to London. Laura had married Paul Lafarge, a French-Cuban medical student and socialist, in 1868. Eleanor, Tussie, the youngest and in many ways most similar to her father in temperament, remained at home, increasingly serving as Marx's secretary and political confidant. Marx was a doting father and, later, grandfather. He would get down on his hands and knees to give his grandchildren pony rides, despite his painful health conditions. Eleanor recalled how he would patiently build card houses for the children, constructing them higher and higher until the children's delight in knocking them down became irresistible, after which he would calmly begin again. Jenny Marx, Karl's life partner and political companion for almost 4 decades, described their home life in a letter to an American correspondent.
You will find us installed in a small but pretty house in the part of London, which is half town, half country. My husband works in his study upstairs. The children make noise in the drawing room. I sit by the fire and sew. A small garden gives us an abundance of fresh air. On Sundays, we have dinner involving our political friends over which the affairs of nations are disputed adamantly in several languages.
Marx's relationship with Engels remained the bedrock of both his intellectual and personal life. Engels had finally left the Manchester business in 1869, allowing him to move to London and see Marx daily. They would meet at Marx's home or in pubs like the Old Queen's Head or the Grafton Arms, where they would discuss politics, science, and literature over porter or ale. Engels, who had studied military history extensively, would explain battle strategies by arranging beer glasses on the table to represent troop movements. Their regular walks on Hampstead Heath were legendary. They would stride for hours, switching from English to German to French to Latin as their conversation demanded, stopping occasionally for Marx to catch his breath or for Engels to point out a particularly fine view of London. Both men loved nature and were keen observers of the botanical and geological features of their surroundings, often discussing the latest scientific developments during these walks. Engels supported Marx not just financially and intellectually, but emotionally as well. When Marx's health required trips to seaside resorts like Ramsgate or Margate for the sea air, Engels would accompany him when possible, ensuring his friend didn't overtax himself and arranging comfortable accommodations. An acquaintance who observed them together in their later years wrote,
"It was touching to see the tender solicitude with which Engels watched over Marx. He spoke with the deepest respect to the older man, treating him as a father or beloved teacher, and Marx, for all his fierceness with opponents, showed only gentle affection for Engels, his most loyal friend."
In December 1881, Marx suffered a devastating blow when his wife Jenny died after a long battle with cancer. For months, he had watched helplessly as she weakened, spending long nights at her bedside, reading to her from their beloved Shakespeare, or reminiscing about their life together. Her death left him shattered, he told Engels. "The Moor has died too," referring to himself in the third person as if a part of him had died with her. Jenny's funeral at Highgate Cemetery was a small affair, attended by family and a few close political associates. Marx was too overcome with grief to speak, so Engels delivered a eulogy, praising Jenny as not merely Marx's wife, but his intellectual companion and a committed revolutionary in her own right. Marx stood silently by the grave, supported by his daughters, his face ravaged by grief and illness. The loss of Jenny accelerated Marx's physical decline. His doctors ordered him to health resorts in Algeria and the Isle of Wight, seeking relief from his respiratory problems, but improvement was temporary. Then, in January 1883, came another crushing blow. His eldest daughter, Jenny Chen, died of bladder cancer at age 38. Marx was in too poor health to attend her funeral. Eleanor, now his primary caregiver, feared the news might kill him and initially tried to hide it. When he finally learned of his daughter's death, Marx fell into deep despair. He told Engels that he had lived too long, having to bury both his wife and his child. On March 4th, 1883, Karl Marx died peacefully in his armchair. Eleanor had left him napping and returned to find that he had passed away in his sleep. She sent a message to Engels with the simple words, "The Moor is dead." Engels rushed to the house at Maitland Park Road. In a letter written that same evening, he described the scene. "I find the house in tears. It seemed the end had come unexpectedly. At 2:30, the best time for visiting him, he had been found sleeping softly in his armchair, but he never woke again. The greatest mind of our party has ceased to think. The strongest heart I have ever known has stopped beating." Marx's funeral was held on March 17th, 1883, at Highgate Cemetery, where his wife had been buried 15 months earlier. The ceremony was small. Only 11 people were present, including family members and close political comrades like Engels, Wilhelm Liebknecht, and the French revolutionary Charles Longueuil, Marx's son-in-law. Engels delivered a funeral oration that included these prophetic words. "On the 14th of March, at 2:45 in the afternoon, the greatest living thinker ceased to think. When we entered, we found him sleeping peacefully in his chair, but he had fallen asleep forever. His name will endure through the ages, and so also will his work." Marx was buried in the same grave as his wife. A simple headstone was erected, bearing only the names of Karl and Jenny, their birth and death dates, and later, the names of other family members buried there. In 1956, a more substantial monument with a bust of Marx and the words, "Workers of all lands unite," was installed. Engels was right. Despite repeated pronouncements of Marx's death, Marx's analysis of capitalism continues to inspire movements for social justice worldwide. His insights into alienation, exploitation, commodification, and crisis remain essential for understanding our contemporary world. After Marx's death, Engels devoted himself to completing and publishing his friend's unfinished work. He edited and published volumes 2 and 3 of Capital from Marx's notes and manuscripts, a monumental task of intellectual partnership that extended beyond the grave. Engels organized Marx's papers, responded to correspondence about Marx's ideas, and worked to ensure that his friend's theoretical legacy would continue to inform revolutionary movements worldwide. Engels described their collaborative relationship beautifully. "Marx was a genius. We others were at best talented. Without him, the theory would not be, by far, what it is today. It therefore rightly bears his name." Engels outlived Marx by 12 years, dying in 1895. In his final years, he continued to correspond with socialist leaders worldwide, offering guidance based on his and Marx's decades of theoretical and practical experience. Before his death, he arranged for Eleanor Marx and Marx's other literary executors to preserve the vast collection of unpublished manuscripts and correspondence that scholars would later mine for insights into the development of Marx's thought. Eleanor Marx, who had been closest to her father in his final years, dedicated the rest of her life to promoting his ideas and continuing his work. She translated several of his writings, spoke at workers' meetings throughout Britain, and helped organize unskilled workers into trade unions. Tragically, she took her own life in 1898 at the age of 43, after discovering that her partner, Edward Aveling, had secretly married another woman. Laura Marx Lafargue and her husband Paul continued to be active in the French socialist movement. In a tragic epilogue to the Marx family story, they committed suicide together in 1911 when Paul, at age 69, felt he had become too old to continue contributing to the revolutionary cause. The story of Marx's physical legacy, his papers, books, and belongings, is itself a fascinating journey through the turbulent history of the 20th century. After Engels' death, Marx's unpublished manuscripts were transferred to the German Social Democratic Party. Many remained unpublished until the 1930s, when scholars at the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow began the painstaking work of organizing and publishing the complete works of Marx and Engels. During the Nazi period, many original documents were smuggled out of Germany to save them from destruction. They traveled through several countries before most eventually found their way to Amsterdam's International Institute of Social History and Moscow's Marx-Engels-Lenin Institute. The Cold War divided Marx's physical legacy just as it divided interpretations of his thought. Marx's personal library and annotated books, which contain valuable insights into the development of his ideas, were scattered after his death. Some remained with family members, others were given to friends or political associates, and many were simply lost. Before concluding, we must address the caricatures and misrepresentations that have obscured Marx's actual ideas in life. The image of Marx in popular culture often bears little resemblance to the real man and his thought. He is frequently depicted as a totalitarian who advocated for an all-powerful state, when in fact, he envisioned the state's eventual withering away in a truly free society. In his writings on the Paris Commune, Marx praised the direct democracy established by workers and criticized centralized state power. The Cold War solidified a distorted view of Marx in Western consciousness. He became associated exclusively with Soviet-style communism, despite the fact that Marx himself never outlined a detailed blueprint for socialist society and would likely have been critical of many aspects of 20th century socialist states. As the Soviet Marxist historian Roy Medvedev noted, Stalin's system had about as much relation to Marx's ideas as the Inquisition had to the teachings of Jesus. Another common misrepresentation portrays Marx as an economic determinist who believed that economic factors mechanically determined all aspects of society and culture. This caricature ignores the nuance in Marx's actual view, that humans make their own history, though not under conditions of their choosing. As he wrote in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, "Men make their own history. They do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past." Marx recognized the complex interplay between economic structures and other aspects of society. Politics, law, culture, religion. His model was dialectical, acknowledging that while economic factors are ultimately determinate, ideas and institutions, once established, can exercise their own influence on society. Marx is often accused of ignoring human nature, replacing it with a blank slate theory that assumed humans could be remodeled at will. This characterization completely misunderstands Marx's concept of species being, which offered a sophisticated understanding of human potential. Far from denying human nature, Marx based his entire critique of capitalism on the way it distorts and constrains our inherent capacities for creative, purposeful activity and social cooperation. He saw humans as inherently social beings whose individual development depends on their social relationships. His vision of communism aimed not at creating some new man, but at removing the barriers that prevent people from developing their existing human capacities. Perhaps the most persistent caricature blames Marx for the crimes of 20th century regimes that claimed his mantle. This ignores both historical chronology — Marx died decades before the Russian Revolution — and the significant divergences between Marx's actual ideas and the practices of these regimes. Marx never advocated for one-party states, personality cults, or the suppression of dissent. In fact, he was a lifelong advocate for democratic rights and press freedom, having worked as a newspaper editor and suffered from censorship himself. When confronted with dogmatic interpretations of his theories in his lifetime, Marx famously declared, "I am not a Marxist," indicating his discomfort with rigid orthodoxy. The real Marx was not a prophet offering blueprints for utopia, but a scientific thinker analyzing capitalism's dynamics. His method was critical and anti-dogmatic, constantly revising his views based on new evidence and historical developments. As he wrote to Arnold Rouge, "We do not dogmatically anticipate the world, but only want to find the new world through criticism of the old one." On a personal level, Marx is often portrayed as a dour, humorless ideologue, when contemporary accounts reveal someone with a passion for literature, a sharp wit, and deep personal relationships. He read Shakespeare, Aeschylus, Cervantes constantly. He could recite the first entire book of Hegel's Logic from memory, but also knew long passages from the Iliad by heart and delighted in reading them to his children. His correspondence, especially with Engels, reveals a man capable of self-deprecating humor. Marx was not a disembodied intellect, but a passionate advocate for human liberation who experienced poverty, exile, and loss firsthand. His theoretical insights were informed by his lived experience of capitalism's cruelties, the deaths of his children that might have been prevented with better medical care, the harassment by authorities for his political views, the precarious existence of refugees and political exiles. If we strip away these caricatures, what remains is a thinker whose analysis of capitalism was unparalleled in its depth and scope. Marx identified the system's inherent tendencies toward crisis, concentration of wealth, and colonization of ever more aspects of human life, tendencies that continue to shape our world today. He recognized the revolutionary potential of capitalism to develop productive forces, while also seeing its fundamental contradictions: the social nature of production versus the private appropriation of wealth, the system's need for endless growth versus the planet's finite resources, its creation of abundant wealth alongside persistent poverty. Most importantly, Marx offered not just a critique, but a vision of possibility, a society where production serves human needs rather than profit, where work becomes a means of self-realization rather than mere survival, where human relationships are based on cooperation rather than competition. And this vision was not a utopian fantasy, but grounded in analysis of real tendencies within capitalism itself: the increasingly social nature of production, the development of technology that could liberate humanity from drudgery, the emergence of working-class solidarity and organization. In our time of growing inequality, climate crisis, and renewed interest in the social alternatives, Marx's analysis remains an essential tool for our understanding of the world, not as dogma to be uncritically accepted, but as a method of critical thinking to be creatively applied to contemporary conditions. What remains most vital in Marx's legacy is not any specific prediction or policy prescription, but his method, a way of analyzing society that looks beneath surface appearances to underlying structures, that sees social formations as historical rather than natural, that understands the connections between economic relations and broader aspects of human life. Most importantly, Marx offers us a vision of human potential beyond capitalism, a society where production serves human needs rather than profit. As we face the challenges of our own era, we would do well to remember Marx's famous thesis on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Until next time, this has been the Dialectic Dose. I'm Austin Constantino. Thank you for joining me on this journey.